Ms. Bondi, just yes or no, would you agree that government officials should be respectful and supportive of victims' families as they mourn?
First, Congresswoman, thank you for talking about that, and I'm so very sorry for what happened to your family.
Has 3 clips, 3 answers, and 1 problem she cannot escape. She asked to apologize to victims. She refuses. She asked about Epstein files, and she starts talking about the stock market. And she pressed on reductions and gets told, I caught you red-handed.
Come on, let me finish my answer. We corrected that within 40 minutes. He was already, you're acting like everybody's trying to cover up Wexner's name.
Reclaiming my time.
I'm going to answer this question.
Reclaiming my time.
Mr.
Chairman.
This is how this works.
Can I have my time back?
Mr.
Chairman.
The gentlelady can give her answer. The time belongs to the gentleman from Kentucky.
All right, I'm reclaiming my time.
Can I give my answer?
So
Yes.
I'm going to put the language of the bill up on the screen.
Chairman,
Because I
may I
have
give
another
my answer
question.
on that?
If-
This is
Here's
a political
the question.
joke, and I need to give my answer
Yeah,
on that.
we'll let the Attorney General respond, and then the gentleman can move to his
Chairman,
next question.
it's my time.
Within 40
Chairman.
minutes, you asked me a question.
You can give
Within
me-
40 minutes, Wexner's name was added back.
Within 40 minutes
You
of me catching you red-handed.
There was one redaction out
Where
of
he's
over
listed
40.
as a
Now pause, because this is where it gets strange. None of these are complicated questions. None of these require legal gymnastics. And yet every answer feels like it's just trying to go somewhere else. So either this is just a series of bad moments, coincidence, pressure, bad phrasing, or, and this is the uncomfortable version, these are the only answers she can safely give without making things worse. And if that's true, then the real story isn't what she said, it's what she couldn't say. So as you watch this, don't just listen to his answers, watch what they avoid, because that's where the entire thing just starts to fall apart. The first thing to understand is that this story is not just really about a root answer, one combative tone, or an awkward just exchange. This is the shallow version. The deeper version is that Pam Bondi walked into a hearing just carrying the language of order, competence, compliance, review, protection, and control, and then under questioning just kept producing answers that made those words sound like decorative packaging rather than just operational reality. That matters because there are 2 ways institutions fail in public. One is crude failure, chaos, panic, contradiction, obvious mistakes, and the other one is dangerous, like polished language wrapped around just something that cannot just survive inspection. And what makes this interesting is that Bondi just keeps trying to project the second while accidentally just revealing the first. So from the very beginning, the issue is not whether she sounded forceful. She often did. The issue is whether force substituted for explanation, whether attitude substituted for coherence, and whether posture substituted for accountability. And once you look through that lens, just the hearing becomes almost just darkly funny, because the more aggressively the answers are delivered, the more obvious it becomes that the delivery is compensating for the weakness of the answer itself. That's why the clip spreads. Not because the viewers love procedure, but because normal people can feel when someone is just answering around a problem instead of through it. And they may not call it premise evasion, burden shifting, or narrative substitution, or relevance collapse, but they feel it immediately. And what they are feeling is this: the answers are not failing at the margins, they are failing at the center. So let's begin with the core claim behind the entire defense. The department wants the public to believe there was a functioning system here: review, protection, layering oversight, and careful handling, and substantial effort, and lots of lawyers, lots of hours, lots of process. Fine. But then a very simple test appears. If the system existed in a serious way, it was advertised, why did the victim just identifying material reportedly surface publicly at all? Notice, this is not even a hostile question, it's a competence question, because when an institution describes itself as meticulous and the exact category it says it was protecting, the category that ends up exposed, the problem is no longer cosmetic. The problem is not that the execution was not perfect. The phrase is far too gentle for what the logic is doing here. If you are building a bridge and it collapses under the exact weight it was just designed to hold, that's not an imperfection. That's a failure at the point of purpose. And that is what makes the defense sounding ridiculous. The system is described in the language of rigor, but the outcome is described in the facts of leakage. And the rhetoric says control, the result says bridge, and the branding says protection, and the event says exposure. Those two things collide, the institution is left with a humiliating choice. So either the safeguards were real and they still failed, which makes the process look incompetent, or the safeguards were overstated, which makes the presentation look misleading. And either way, the bragging collapses into self-indictment. So before Bondi even just opens her mouth at the hearing, their architecture is already unstable, and the clips don't create instability. They merely revealed on camera. Now comes the question that should have been the easiest one in the entire hearing. Not legal, not procedural, not partisan, human. Will you apologize to the victims? This is where it stops being a strategy and becomes something worse, self-exposure. Because this question is low complexity and high morality, which means there are very few ways to answer it without damaging yourself. And yet Bondi somehow finds one of the worst available options. Why is this so devastating? Because the apology question is not really asking for a confession of a legal guilt. It's testing something more basic. Can an institution acknowledge harm without treating empathy as a surrender? And that's the test. And if the answer were yes, the response would be easy. And if the review process just worked as advertised, then apologizing cost almost nothing, since the harm was supposedly minimal. And if the process failed, then apologizing is a minimum threshold of seriousness, because actual people were exposed. So the question is not a trap because it's unfair. It's a trap because it's fair. And fair questions are just the most dangerous ones when an institution is just already brittle. Then watch what happens. Instead of answering the moral content of the question, Bondi shifts sideways. Why didn't you ask someone else? Why wasn't this asked before? And then the line is that makes the entire moment detonate. I'm not going to get in the gutter. Now stop there, because that sentence is one of those rare moments where a person thinks she is elevating herself and instead just drives herself straight into absurdity. For that line to work, the viewer has to silently accept several degrading assumptions at once. That apologizing to the victims is a gutter. That acknowledging injury is beneath just a high official. That direct accountability is a theatrical ambush rather than just a legitimate demand. And that the problem is not what happened to the victims, but the indignity of being asked about it out loud. And the second those hidden assumptions are dragged into a daylight, the answer turns from hard-edged into ludicrous, because it no longer sounds like a strength, and it sounds like someone is trying to reclassify decency as an attack so she does not have to supply it. And that's why the moment is so powerful. It's not merely evasive, it's morally backwards. And it takes the lowest cost available, simple human acknowledgement, and treats it as if it were degradation, which means the institution is no longer defending the adequacy of its conduct. It's defending the right not to recognize the human consequences of that conduct. And that is a spectacular public failure, not because it's rude, but because it quietly announces that the system cannot survive both scrutiny and empathy at the same time. Then we get to the moment that is so detached from underlying question that it's almost just a place like a satire. She is asked about Epstein files, victims' exposure, public release, reductions, damage, and she starts talking about it, how the market, retirement accounts, and SAP and economic numbers. Now, this is not just a non-answer. It's a category error so extreme that it becomes a funny on the first contact and damaging on the second thought. And because when a question belongs to one category, victim exposure, institutional handling, accountability, and the answer is imported from an entirely different category, microeconomic bragging, marketing indices, public relationship optimism, you're no longer watching reasoning. You're watching substitution, and substitution matters. It tells you the speaker has decided that original question space is too dangerous to remain inside, so she has to flee it entirely, not soften it, not narrow it, not reframe it carefully, abandon it. This is the key. A person confident in her answer doesn't just need to leave the subject, and a person who cannot just safely remain in the subject often does. And this is why the clip has that bizarre, almost second-hand embarrassment quality. So it's not simply irrelevant, it's conspicuously irrelevant, and it's a kind of pivot so aggressive that it stops just functioning as persuasion and starts functioning as a confession. Because ask yourself, what argument would have to be true for this to count as responsive? It would have to be something like, as long as the market is up, institutional harm is tolerable. As long as retirement accounts are thriving, victims' exposure becomes secondary. And as long as macroeconomic indicators look good, process integrity no longer matters. But say that aloud and it instantly just sounds unhinged. No serious person would defend that principle directly, which is exactly why the pivot is so revealing. The answer borrows the emotional tone of success from another subject, because the speaker cannot generate success from the subject actually under discussion. And that's not persuasion. That's rhetorical money laundering. And to take a dirty question rooted through a clean talking point, hope the audience just emotionally registers the shine instead of just noticing the transfer. And it's something that works for a few seconds, but here it just overshoots so badly that it becomes comic. And it's like being asked about a gas leak and answering with a restaurant review. Language is happening, but reality has been abandoned, and viewers sense that immediately. And that's why this spreads. The gap between question and answer becomes so wide that the audience no longer just needs expert commentary to notice it. They can feel the panic built into the pivot itself. So now we get to the cleanest public humiliation in the sequence. A name is redacted, a lawmaker asks why, and the Bondi responds effectively, we fixed it within 40 minutes. And the reply lands, 40 minutes of catching you red-handed? This is brutally because it destroys the fallback defense most institutions just love to use. And the fallback defense is always some version of, yes, but the problem was corrected quickly, so the process should still be trusted. No. Fast correction can reduce the duration of an error. It does not just erase the existence of the error. And in some cases, it makes the weakness look worse, because it proves the problem was not theoretical or hypothetical or hidden just deep in the file structure. So it was active, exposed, visible, and serious enough to fix only after being called out. And that's why the exchange bites so hard, that we fixed it. Line tries to perform competence retroactively, but the correction has the opposite effect. It shows that the reduction was not product of some unassailable, rigorous process. It was weak enough to be broken in public. And once that happens, the next question becomes unavoidable. Was this the only one that was wrong? Or just the one member had the time and leverage to force back into the light? That's the second order damage. That particular error matters, yes, but the real injury is what it does to trust in the surrounding review apparatus. So once the audience sees one visible correction made under pressure, the institution just loses the luxury of assuming all the unseen decisions were sound. Now, every unseen decision inherits suspicion, and that's why the line red-handed lands like a hammer. It compresses the whole problem into one humiliating insight. The institution did not just discover and fix the flaw before scrutiny, and scrutiny discovered and fixed the flaw for institution. And that's not mastery. That's dependency on being monitored. And the institution that requires internal embarrassment to produce internal correction looks less like an authority and more like a sloppy student hoping the teacher doesn't just notice a bad paragraph. So now shift from handling to credibility. Because one of the most recurring ways officials destroy themselves is not by making one giant lie, but by using one phrase loosely in a context where looseness is fatal. So here, that phrase is client list. Once the phrase enters the public bloodstream, expectations harden instantly. People do not fear it as vague, just bureaucratic shorthand. They fear it as a concrete thing, with the concrete implications sitting in a concrete reach. Then later comes the retreat. There is no incriminating client list, or the phrase meant something broader, or the original wording was not to be taken as a way the public plainly took it. Now, from a lawyering standpoint, there are several defenses you can just imagine here. Maybe the phrase was imprecise, maybe it was casual and later narrowed, maybe the later clarification is more accurate. Fine. But notice what all those defenses have in common. They still concede the same underlying point. The language was used carelessly in an environment where carelessness was guaranteed to generate distortion. And that's what makes this politically and rhetorically stupid, because credibility is not only damaged by provable falsehood, it's also damaged by preventable ambiguity in the high volatility environments when you speak into an atmosphere already loaded with conspiracy, suspicion, hope, obsession, and public anticipation. You don't get to act surprised when loose phrases metastasize. So if you choose imprecision there, you're renting a match inside a fireworks warehouse, and then when the later correction arrives, the damage is already confined to that one phrase, and every future phrase starts paying a tax, because viewers now have to ask, is this precise, or will this also be walked back later once the political temperature changes? So this is not merely a semantics issue, it's trust issue produced by misuse of semantics. And that's why it's so deadly. Not because the viewers become scholars of wording, but because they began to suspect that the wording is being used as moving surface just rather than a stable representation of reality. And once that suspicion exists, every polished sentence begins to look like a packaging. So now the structure gets even uglier. Because one of the strangest episodes in the whole effort is the allegation that lawmakers are viewing unredacted files on a DOJ system. Because one of the strangest episodes in this whole effort is allegations that lawmakers are viewing unredacted files on a DOJ system may have had their searches tracked or displayed. And if true, or even credibly perceived, the issue is bigger than privacy, bigger than just one hearing, bigger than one spat. It flips the institutional mood of the room. Why? Because congressional oversight has a direction. Congress examines and executes. The legislature questions the department, and the overseers inspect the institution. But if the institution begins watching the behavior of the overseers while just they conduct the oversight, the direction curled back on itself. So now the inspected body looks like just acquiring visibly into inspectors. And even if someone tries to explain that way bureaucratically, system just settings, log practices, and technical design and shared terminals, whatever, the perception problem is already catastrophic, because a clean oversight environment just does not feel like the subject of review was learning about the investigator's movement in real time. And it feels warped. It feels dystopian. It feels like the room itself has become contaminated. And this is another place where the system manages to make itself look foolish by overreaching into the domain where common sense is enough to convict the optics. Yet, you do not need a long policy paper to know that the entity being reviewed just should not appear to be appearing back over the shoulder of the people reviewing it. That violates the intuitive geometry of accountability. So even before anyone resolves every technical detail, the damage is already conceptual. The scene itself tells the audience something is off. And once that happens, every subsequent defense sounds reactive rather than authoritative. Now we leave clip word and enter structure word, because viral moments are one thing, formal process is another. Once testimony begins to look evasive, incomplete, inconsistent, or strategically detached from a question, oversight does what it's supposed to do. It escalates subpoena, deposition, sworn testimony, binding answers, and a forum where the cost of saying foolish things goes up, because the answers are not just floating through a cable news air anymore. They are attached to an oath, a record, a proceeding, and that's exactly where a confident institution should want to go. If your story is conquering, so you welcome the formal forum. If your record is strong, you prefer the setting where precision matters. If your answers improve under scrutiny, so you lean towards the structure itself or away from it. But what do we get instead? This is unnecessary. Look at the documents elsewhere. So do not ask me directly in a mechanism just specifically built to test directly answers. So go consume surrounding material and infer what you can from that. That's absurd. And it's not merely evasive, it's institutionally unserious. It's like being called a witness and replying, actually, the jury can just browse my paperwork and spare me the inconvenience of being down verbally. No, the whole point of testimony is that a living person is forced to connect claims, facts, responsibility, timing, and meaning in real time without an infinite room to retreat into abstraction. And that's why testimony exists. When Bondi or the surrounding apparatus acts as though their request was warrant clarification itself just somehow excessive. They make themselves look ridiculous. And because scrutiny is not an optional and no one's attached to authority, it's the price of authority. And trying to repackage the price as unfair treatment only reveals that the actual danger is not the accusation itself. So the danger is being required to answer in a setting where the evasion becomes measurable. And that's a deep embarrassment here. The institution does not look overburdened. It looks afraid of a venue in which its language would finally have to stop being flexible. So now zoom out beyond Epstein. And because this is where the broader system starts looking not just evasive but unstable. That's a memorandum ordering the compilation of lists, groups, entities, and recurring updates, and domestic terrorism framing, and classification activity, operational follow-through. A question is then asked, does such list exist? And that's not a philosophical question. That's not an interpretive prompt. That's a yes or no question, asking just whether the thing just described in the directive has materialized in the word. And yet the answer doesn't just arrive in a yes or no form. And this is important because one of the oldest tells in the public testimony is their just refusal to meet in shape of the question. So sometimes the reason is complexity, sometimes the reason is legal limitation, and sometimes the reason is truthful. Short answer is politically just ugly. And that's why this lands the way it does. Because once a simple structural question cannot get a simple structural answer, as the public imagination begins doing the work the witness refused to do. So either the list exists and disclosure is being avoided, or the list doesn't just exist in any meaningful form and the directive begins to look performative, or the list does not exist in any meaningful form and the directive begins to look performative. So either way, the government manages to look bad in two different registers at once. In one register, it looks secretive and overreaching, and in other way, it looks theatrical and unserious. And that dual embarrassment is rare. Usually, institutions get to choose whether they want to appear threatening or incompetent. Here, the refusal risks both simultaneously. And that's why the moment matters. A serious state should not just look like it's just running a secret machinery it will not describe. It also should not look like it's issuing grand directives mainly for dramatic effect while ducking the obvious follow-up questions. And the refusal makes both interpretations available, which is precisely what disciplined answers are supposed to prevent. Now connect the pieces, but do not do it lazily. Do not merely say, see, there is a pattern, as if repetition by itself proves anything. That's too cheap. The more precise point, at this moment, the same style keeps recurring. When the subject is morally dangerous, empathy is reframed as theatrics. When the question is institutionally dangerous, the answer is important from another subject. And when the error is visible, correction is used as a shield instead of just an admission. And when the wording backfires, clarification arrives after expectations just were already weaponized. When formal scrutiny appears, the forum itself is treated like the inconvenience, and when yes or no questions arise, the answer just migrates away from yes or no territory. That's not random. That's not one bad afternoon. That's a style of governance and communication in which the primary impulse is not to resolve a contradiction, but to survive it rhetorically until the next cycle. And this is why viewers who know nothing about procedure still sense something rotten here, because ordinary people do not need doctoral training to detect when words are being used defensively instead of descriptively. They know what it sounds like when someone is trying to get through a conversation without even just trying to the conversation to touch a real nerve. That instinct is what the clips are feeding. The clips are popular not only because a Bondi looks aggressive or combative. Plenty of combative officials go viral and look in comment. These clips go viral because the aggression often appears attached to avoidance rather than attached to mastery, and that distinction is fatal. When force is paired with clarity, it can look strong. When force is paired with evasion, it starts looking like a camouflage. And camouflage is most obvious when it's over-applied. And one thing just worth saying directly is that part of what makes this so watchable is that some of these moments are genuinely funny in a bleak way, not because the underlying subject is funny, it's not, but because the mismatch between the seriousness of the subject and the unseriousness of the response produces a kind of institutional slapstick. So you asked about the victim and get a disdain. You asked about the files and get an SDAC. So you expose a reduction and get retroactive competence theater. You ask for sworn clarity and get a suggestion to read around the witnesses instead of hearing from the witnesses. That's laughable, yes, but not trivial. It's a laughter people use when they see authority behaving in a way that makes authority look childish, and the laughter is a recognition mechanism. It's how viewers register that the emperor is not merely just underdressed, but actually pretending that lack of disclosing is a sign of superior tailoring, and that's why mockery can become so destructive here, because the answers are not merely flawed under close legal analysis, they are visibly self-defeating under normal human listening. And that's a nightmare for any official, not just being criticized by experts, but being understood by non-experts. And once that happened, the protective shell of jargon, office title, and institutional tone starts to crack. So after all of this, we arrive at the real question. Now, whether Bondi had a hearing. Not whether one answer was clumsy, not whether critics on one side or another are exaggerating. The real question is whether a transparency regime, an accountability structure, and justice apparatus can still credibly demand a trust when the public repeatedly sees a harm followed by evasion, correction, followed by self-contradiction, and discomfort with a formal scrutiny and normal questions to test belief. So because trust is not built by saying just the word transparency, trust is not built by evoking a process in abstract. Trust is built when the institution proves it can survive the two things. Bondi's answers kept resisting direct questions and the morality legible consequences, and that is the hardest point in the whole video. If the system worked, you would expect clarity without panic. If the system failed, you would expect accountability without contempt. But what public kept just getting is the third thing. A system that just sounds defensive before it sounds explanatory, and that should bother everyone, regardless of party, because once institutions just learn they can substitute aggression for coherence and still just expect obedience, the public is left with a dangerous lesson that official language is no longer just information until tested, that the confidence is no longer just evidence until pressed, that a clean statement is a sharp denial, a polished phrase, a defiant tone, and none of it means very much until you force it stay inside the actual question long enough to see whether it can live there. And that's really the whole story here. Not one woman, not one clip, not one hearing. A broader exposure of what happens when the institution still wants the prestige of authority after it has begun losing just discipline required to deserve it. So now you've seen it. Not one mistake, not one awkward answer. A pattern where every difficult question gets redirected, softened, or avoided just enough to survive. And here is a part that should stay with you. When answers stop saying inside the question, so you're not getting clarity, you're getting strategy. So the next time you hear a clean statement, a confident response, a perfect explanation, don't ask if it sounds strong. Ask, does it actually answer what was asked? Because that's where the truth either holds or quietly disappears. If this breakdown made you see it differently, drop a comment, tell me what moment stood out to you most. Subscribe if you want more of this, where we don't just watch clips, we break them down until they can't hide anymore. And if there is a hearing, interview, or a clip you want me to dissect next, write it below. I will pick one. I will pick the best one for the next video.